Chris Horrie, hello.
Hi there.
How are you?
Great.
Very
All
glad.
the better for being on PoliticsJOE.
Very glad to have you here.
The new wave of news.
That's us. Before we start, we're here to talk about The Sun, the BBC, whole host of issues there, particularly given recent weeks. But first, could I ask you to tell me who you are? How would you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm a journalist and I've been an academic as well and a lecturer. I've written probably about 13 books in various editions, most of them spectacular flops, except one about the Sun newspaper, which became an unexpected hit, because everything I think is interesting, most people think it's boring, and when I think it's boring, everybody seems to like it, but there you are.
And so here we are talking about the Sun newspaper.
Yeah, that book's done well. It became a Hollywood movie.
Oh yeah.
It's been lifted and plagiarised for West End plays and frequently held in evidence against the Sun.
Yeah,
as one of the greatest cultural abominations of all time. I'm not sure it's quite the most worst thing, but it certainly suits me commercially.
Very good, very good. Well, let's stick to it then. Yeah. Let's stick to it. So obviously we're talking, because just over a week ago, The Sun broke a story alleging that a BBC presenter had been taken off air, and this is a quote, after paying teenager for sexual pictures. Since then, the presenter has been revealed to be Huw Edwards. Mm-hmm. The Met Police has said that no criminal activity had taken place, and the young person contacted the BBC via their lawyer to say that, quote, nothing unlawful or inappropriate had happened, and that they had sent a denial to The Sun before the initial story was published. How would you describe the way that The Sun reported this story?
For them, it's a good story, but it's not a great story, because I imagine the first reaction of a Sun reader, in fact, almost anybody under about 40, to this story would be, who the hell is Huw Edwards? And then when they hear of what he's been accused of, the next reaction is going to be, so what? So it's a kind of a bit of a workaday story, but The Sun, it's a talking story. They have this jargon. It means it goes there, it hits the chattering classes. I mean, here we are in Islington, talking about it.
Yes.
And so you get a kind of ripple effect, and everybody's talking about The Sun. So many people, The Sun's paid-for circulation has collapsed because it really can't compete with the internet. The internet is a tabloid journalism on steroids in every single way. So again, many of the older generation would have thought, well, The Sun, is that still going? So and now everybody will be reminded of the fact, because it's exactly where it wants to be, in the middle of a huge spat, with a kind of a sexual element to it, but that's not really foregrounded here. It's not one of them sex things, really. They're not in the foreground. It's a loathsomeness issue. And they're able to pose, again, exactly where they want to be, which is on the side of the little person, the ordinary person, against the establishment. And here, fair play to them, they've hit the bullseye of the British establishment. The main stentorian, is that the word? Look at it later. News announcer of the BBC, practically a member of the royal family, possibly a more important figure in the British Constitution than the somewhat raggedy excuse for a monarchy we have these days, intoning on royal funerals and if there was a 9/11 in Britain, he'd be there, and all the time he's getting up to things which is we don't really know the full detail, but on a spectrum somewhere between risible and loathsome.
And do you see the positioning, a bit of a tangent here, but you mentioned there, right, a talking story and the role that the newspapers now play, which is almost in informing discourse and debate, i.e., in a newsroom, broadcast newsroom, the papers will be out and the producers are leafing through them, looking for stories, looking for things, and in a way, the papers almost have a lower circulation, but that circulation is an influential one. The people that still pay attention to what they're saying are then dictating what's being said in other media.
Well, when you look at news, my great social and scientific discovery 20 or more years ago was, and it hadn't dawned on the newspapers yet, was that they'd lost the battle for news to television. It took them like 10 or 20 years, it took them to the 70s to realise that in terms of news, like football results, for example, genuine stuff that's happening that you don't know. They were well behind, first of all, radio and then television. And now what's happened in the last 10 years or so is the Sun, and in fact any newspaper, the posh ones as well as the red tops, have totally lost the battle to the internet, and specifically to things like Twitter. So most people get their hot news about whether Man United have signed a new centre-back or whatever, or the latest sex rumours about the royal family. They get that from Twitter. You know, it's 5-6 hours later when the newspapers, all the newspapers, not just the Sun, drop in the news agents, and you can read the same thing. So if they're still going to have a business, they're going to go off the news agenda. They're going to have to do things, frankly, like this, which is talk about the news, have an interesting angle, or just dig things out, which are not on the formal news agenda. But they're in second place completely now to Twitter, Instagram, and all the rest of it. So their business is declining. So how can you still persuade people to part with the best part of a pound now for the Sun, unless it does key things, that it's funny, it's got a funny take on the news, it's scandalous, it's got more angles than a protractor, as they say. And Huw Edwards is perfect for this. I mean, legally the story was sound, because the parents are making the allegation, and it's a sworn affidavit. Now, in terms of journalism, particularly tabloid journalism, but all tabloid journalism, the truth means something that will stand up in a court. Yep. And if you've got an affidavit, that's an old-fashioned word, a witness statement, and they've sworn it, legally, we have to be careful what we're saying about the parents. There is a phenomena of checkbook journalism, which was kind of out of control in the 70s, but the legal system came down like a ton of bricks on that in terms of contempt of court and grooming witnesses and all the rest of it. But the Sun, as they emphasised over and over again, this is a sworn statement by the parents. And if it is untrue, and we have no indication that the parents were lying, let's emphasise that,
absolutely,
to be fair to them and for legal reasons, then don't take it up with us. Don't shoot the messenger. We as journalists, if you look in the Code of Conduct, and indeed in various judgments in the High Court, reporters have a responsibility to report things. So in other words, they couldn't suppress this report. They couldn't cover it up once they'd known about it. So the Sun is pretty much home and hosed on this, I think.
Okay, home and hosed legally, legal justification for publishing it. Do you think there's an editorial justification for publishing it? Do you think there's a public interest in this story?
Yes, I think there is a public interest in somebody who has the prominence in public life of Huw Edwards. He must expect an extra degree of scrutiny. Now, if you or I get up to something stupid or horrible, unless it is illegal or unless it's endangering somebody, then it's nobody's business. But rather like the royal family and other senior people in public life, Huw Edwards got to expect this. Now, is the Sun being hypocritical about this? Yes, because all tabloid journalism is really built on hypocrisy. I think it was Cudlip himself that sometimes who may well have worked in this very building here in Clerkenwell, where the Mirror was based, said, nobody ever went bust underestimating the taste, and for that matter decency, of the general public. And they're in the sell it high, the pile it high, sell it cheap business, and I don't think people would be vastly interested in what Huw Edwards gets up to, especially younger people that just shrug, but they've heard of him, they've seen him, they think it's a bit funny and weird. It's kind of almost worth mentioning in the pub. Maybe you can make a lame joke about it somehow. So it's in the paper, it's part of the mix. Is it all-time humdinger story for the Sun? No, it's just day in, day out business.
And in your view, that public interest, because of Huw Edwards' position within the BBC, the public interest outweighs his right to privacy? Yes.
I think if you are a public figure like him, you must expect a very high degree of investigation and intrusion into your privacy. Now, the BBC, talking about hypocrisy, they've also done it. There was the case of Cliff Richard just a couple of years ago, a person where I don't think they even had an affidavit. They just had rumours.
Yeah.
And they staked him out, basically. I think they hired a helicopter.
I mean, they televised a raid on his house.
Yeah, kind of live, rolling now to the Cliff Richards. There was no justification for that, other than maybe they'd been the light entertainment world, again treading very carefully, had been exposed in quite serious wrongdoing. And Cliff Richard was of a certain generation, and he was of a certain propensity to appear on a certain top of the pop. So maybe they thought, well, we'd better get our retaliation in first on this one. So yeah, if you're in public life, I mean, people in public life, they have PR people. They have, Huw Edwards. I don't know the detail here. I don't want to be wrong.
Yep.
But he'll have memoirs, and he'll have My Great Days reporting the news, and he'll have a PR person trying to get him on PoliticsJOE and everything else. So you can't choose, and even on things that are not watched anymore, like Newsnight. So except by crazy people. But if you go into the kitchen. We're talking about tabloids, so let's spray the cliches about as much as possible.
Go for it.
If you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen.
Out of the kitchen, yeah.
I was surprised, actually, that there was no rumour mill about him. So that was my initial scepticism, saying, well, hang on, this might be checkbook journalism. What's going on here? Because how could he be involved in apparently what's been described as, again, not scientifically, as some kind of nervous breakdown? And nobody's noticed it until furious parents start knocking on the BBC's door with sworn statements. Surely that's a bit of a failure of management. I mean, all of us have been in teams, and I've even led teams, and sometimes you have people who clearly are, well, frankly, in a gloomy mood, just staring at the wall for hours and hours, and you have to go up and put a shoulder around saying, can we give you any counselling? That doesn't seem to have happened at the BBC. So BBC management failure again.
Chris, what do you think the mood will be in the Sun's offices today and over recent days? Do you think they'll view this as a success?
It's a moderate success. For a fantasy, they have those old-fashioned hunting trophies, on a shield, like a tiger and a bison. I don't know what Huw Edwards. He's certainly not a rhino. I mean, he's. It's not like bringing down some of the big names of the past.
And do you think they're?
I think a lot of their audience doesn't watch BBC News, doesn't care about BBC News. So it's not a humdinger like it's not like, say, a Premier League footballer.
Got you. And there is a broader interest here, though, within News UK and News Corp because of Rupert Murdoch's well-documented opposition to the BBC. I mean, David Yelland has mentioned, previous editor of The Sun, David Yelland has mentioned how in one of sort of his first few weeks he wrote a leader sort of castigating the Beeb, knowing that it would curry favour with Murdoch. Do you think it serves that purpose as well for them?
Full disclosure, I worked briefly on the staff of the BBC as a reporter, and a couple of the books I've written, which have been well reviewed, were essentially campaigning to preserve the BBC against the relentless campaign of privatisation that not just the Murdoch press, because the Daily Mail is probably even more aggressive, but certainly the BBC's commercial rivals who wanted to see it either abolished or perhaps cut down to a kind of safety net service. I mean, the BBC is one of the great public institutions of like social democratic Britain, of the 60s and 70s, like the NHS and free university places, all that kind of jazz. It was kind of like the NHS of news. It was dull, you had to queue up and it was all hassle, everything. But basically, it wouldn't kill you. You wouldn't get diabetes from watching it. Whereas the tabloids were much tastier and spicier and everything like that. So they wanted the fair play in a free society, in a capitalist society, a market society. These are businesses, and it's hard to run a news business against the BBC as was, because it was news, you know, you could watch news round the clock, pretty reliable, well-resourced, international news, local news, dozens of specialist correspondents. And that's one reason why the tabloids in Britain were so stupid or so silly, because they couldn't do the actual news. They had to fill in with crazy stuff about celebrities and soft porn, like things that the BBC couldn't do. Soft porn, page 3, wall-to-wall football stuff, because the BBC couldn't, because of the agreements they had with the FA. So they would find niches in the market. Now, because the BBC was so predominant in hard news at local level as well. So they wanted it out of the way, and perhaps reduced to a safety net service. Like, that's the great horror with the NHS, isn't it? They wouldn't want to see it go entirely, because they need something there to do, you know, religious broadcasting or the royal weddings and the royal funerals, which actually amongst young people there isn't a big audience for that. But you're not going to get MPs voting to have a situation where you could have a coronation and all the media, PoliticsJOE and the less serious tabloid media, you just go, well, that's dull, who cares? Some crazy man in a metal hat. Let's have some more stuff about what do you?
Westminster politics, or Richard Drax and his Dorset
estate.
This
is deep end.
Exactly.
I keep forgetting.
Exactly, you know it. Okay, you mentioned page 3, so let's just. I think there's that's an important reference point here, because before the Sexual Offences Act passed in 2003, changing the age at which you could print sexual images came up to 18. The Sun, particularly in the case, I'm thinking of Sam Fox. I think it may also have happened maybe with Lindsay Dawn Mackenzie. Publishing topless photos of 16-year-old girls. You mentioned earlier also that the tabloids are built on hypocrisy. Do you think this is a clear case of that hypocrisy in action? The Sun was happy to print sexual images of 16-year-olds, admittedly about 40 years ago, and now it's sort of adopting the moral high ground to castigate Edwards. Do you think there's an angle there?
It's a clear case of hypocrisy on the part of the Sun. But also on the part of the general public, I feel. They are based on one fundament of it is hypocrisy. The next fundament is the very clever manipulation of the law and regulation. Pornography, I think, is as old as cavemen and stuff. And you've always made a pretty penny out of pornography. Again, with my boring academic hat on, I mean, when the printing press was invented in the 17th century, it was originally a Bible making machine, because there were changes in Christianity and everybody had to read the Bible in their own language. We needed lots of Bibles. Monks couldn't do it, so necessity is the mother of invention. We get the printing press. Bibles. And somebody works out you can print porn on it. And so in a non-stop process of distributing pornographic material. Now, the point is that porn has varied in its legality. That's the issue. And porn of any sort was illegal in Britain even in the 60s for the newspapers. Essentially illegal. It certainly would have broken press regulation. But then the Sun worked out, if you wrote a story about the girl, a news story, and her job involved occasionally taking her clothes off, then you could run it. So the thing about page 3, and the most, to me and to many of the feminists and others who criticise it, was not so much the picture, because a beautiful topless woman is a beautiful topless woman. You have them in adverts, you have them in movies, was the demeaning captions, the mocking captions that they had about the women. But those were absolutely necessary to say, well, it's just a news story. So the first ones were all about, oh, there's a new trend towards topless bathing. So we spoke to a topless bathing girl, and then she was a posed porno picture. And then if the cops ever turned up and saying, what are you up to? Say, oh yeah, I am a topless bathing person, really. And like she'd been paid 50 quid or whatever it was to do the modelling thing. And then there was the hypocrisy, because a lot of, if you do an opinion poll, what do you think about pornography? Oh, it's terrible. I never touch it and everything like that.
Yeah.
And then these things sell in their million. On the internet, I believe it's into the quintillions of some impressions of these things. So, yeah, hypocrisy, but hypocrisy all round, right? And cleverness. You see, lots of people don't like Rupert Murdoch. He is portrayed, after all, as an evil fiend and a monster in Succession and all the rest of it. That's not unreasonable. But he's also very clever, and so are his lawyers. And he's very sharp people. I think sharp, kind of scammy, kind of clever, tricky kind of way of approaching the world is what they prize more than anything else.
I think it's in the
anything
book.
that gives them a competitive edge.
Absolutely. I think you describe in the book the Sun and also the News of the World as being the cornerstone of Murdoch's empire.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just a fact. You just have to go and look at the numbers.
Yeah.
There'd be no Sky, there'd be no Fox, there'd be no international empire, particularly after the Wapping dispute, where again, the 70s, the trade union power and all the rest of it, that provided jobs for lazy people or underemployed people. He stripped all that out, and the Sun was just a license to print money beyond belief for a decade.
Because the Sun, before he bought it in 1969, was a broadsheet with a commitment to the labour movement, and that obviously changed. And could you talk us through his process, because he's been far from hands off in the Sun and how it's developed and changed, particularly since then. But yeah, Wapping, etc. It's an irony there, right? But
he first of all, he's very committed to the idea that it's a business, that journalism doesn't have these highfalutin goals of enlightening the public, of hypocritically he'll say, well, we are the fourth estate, who guards the guardians, we keep the politicians straight. Yeah, he'll do a bit of that, but basically it's a business like selling sausages or selling anything. So how do you win? You make you study the market leader. Let's say it's Coca-Cola, and you want to get into the fizzy drinks racket. So you study Coca-Cola. You make an exact copy of it, as close as copyright law will allow, right? So you say, oh, well, it's got this chemical and it's not that chemical. Is that okay? No, it's still just a rip-off. So you have to change it a bit more. You use the same branding. You use the same feel in the adverts. You use the same distribution network, and you sell it for half the price. And then you wait for the market leader to go bust. And you are now the market leader, and you double the price. And that's more or less... You don't have to go to Peckham Business School with Del Boy to learn this, but so that's all he's ever really done. He goes into markets, particularly markets that are highly regulated, like the British television market. He looks at the BBC or ITV, makes a copy of it, Sky, or British satellite broadcasting, a real specialist, I remember it. He made an exact copy of it. He cut out all the boring bits. He emphasised all the sexy bits, including actual sexy bits, like with the Sun, and he sold it cheaper. And then he did a lot of cross-promotion. So he endlessly promoted Sky in the Sun and the Sun in the Sky. And then he reaches a position that amounts to a monopoly. Then, the function, the legitimate function, you might say, of the press, of persecuting politicians and making their lives hell, and dragging them across the coals for when they are misleading the public. He uses that function to attack people who attack his monopoly. Now, the evidence, that's more of a matter of opinion. Based on my evidence, they would deny it. But there's plenty of evidence that people who have tried to stand up to the Sun in Parliament have been destroyed. That they when I was looking at this, the Sun and the News of the World of blessed memory, which only did muckraking, they all feared the negative power of Murdoch. Right? He couldn't get you into power. Yeah, he couldn't. There was a mad moment when he thought the Green Party might be good, so they got behind the Green Party for some reason, briefly, and it didn't make much difference. However, they can destroy you.
Yeah.
And the great complaint of the Labour Party was that it had been used to destroy their leaders, like mind you, they had terrible leaders. I mean, in an age of television, none of them were televisual.
Yeah.
That's the other great rule of politics now. People who look good on TV win. And Labour was totally incapable of producing anybody who looked remotely good on TV until Blair.
That's really interesting, because I was going to ask you about the pervasive influence about the Sun under Murdoch on elections and British politics, because it's a maxim, whether or not it's true or not. People say no one's won an election in this country without being backed by the Sun. But it's interesting to hear you say that it's not a positive force.
Yeah, you've got the maxim wrong, because I think that's lifted from my book.
Is it? Is it?
Yeah.
Go on.
The evidence is nobody's won an election when they're opposed by the Sun.
There you go.
Yes.
That's it.
Yeah, they can go. They can go negative on you.
Yeah.
And they can
Destroy you.
Funny, vicious, beautifully photographed, clever, witty, satirical stuff, day after day after day. And by the time they'd finished kicking poor old Michael Foot about, who had no way of responding other than look scared, or Neil Kinnock, who was just a terrible windbag. It was just like all their Christmases at once in a visible person. And it was only when you got really Alistair Campbell, the kind of person you might have had on Politics, Joe. He likes doing this kind of thing.
We've had him on a couple of times.
He's a hard person.
You can call him a bastard if you want
to. He'd be proud of that.
Yeah, I know he would.
He knew how to play the game, you see.
Yeah.
And he would turn the terrorisation machine back on them.
And on the BBC as well.
Given everybody.
Yeah, the topic of conversation.
And I was told by people at the BBC when they were on the Today programme, which at the time, not so sure it's as important as it once was regarded as setting the entire agenda. He would sit next to Blair, glaring at the interviewer, in case they said anything that put Blair in a bad light. So he knew how to play the game. So we got our first ever Labour television president. It was kind of like a Clinton kind of person. Without how deep do you want to go into this digression?
No, it's all right. It's interesting. I mean, we don't have to. It's interesting because I like Huw Edwards is the jumping off point, right?
Yeah.
But we can have a broader conversation.
No, but it links back.
Yeah.
Because the only reason the Sun is remotely interested in Huw Edwards is because he's on the telly.
Yeah.
Therefore, I mean, I got the Sun today. First story is Ronan Keating. He's on the telly.
Yeah.
He's a TV personality, a mid-ranking one.
Yeah.
Bad day.
Yeah.
What they want is the top. They want Bake Off.
Yeah.
What they want is that Mary Berry up to no good.
Yeah.
Use your imagination. Whoa.
Yeah, exactly. It is. It's that. It's all, and it's interesting to see that it's that's the mass media that it's catering to exists around as part of that ecosystem, but it's not necessarily. It hasn't done the same thing yet, really, with let's say social media and social media influencers who have
can't monopolize it.
Yeah, go on.
You can't monopolize it. That's why Murdoch isn't dominating social media. He waited a decade saying, well, I've seen this before. This is like CB radio or something. This is some fad. And we're not going to sink a lot of money into this nonsense. The trendy people in websites and all the rest of it, art school people. We're going to wait until one instance of the internet makes money. Then we'll do our usual thing. We'll make an exact copy of it and we'll monopolize it. He tried it with MySpace, which he eventually bought and lost a load of money. So they don't really know what to do about the internet because it's like the printing press to begin with. Any little business can have their own little printing press and they can get an audience. So how do you monopolize that? Very difficult.
I think
so. Maybe that's the end for the time. And also, but if you aggregate the internet, I'm going to look on the internet.
Yeah.
It functions like a gigantic, luscious tabloid. It's got all the key things: porn,
sport,
scandal, made-up stuff, babies with two heads, outrageous comment, terrible stuff. I mean, the archetypal story that tabloid journals were always told to look for was man fired from cannon hits own wife. And that only comes along. You have to really fake that, but you just have to pay people 50 quid to say it happened.
Yeah,
it comes along once in a lifetime, but you can have 20 of them in 50 seconds on the internet. So how do you compete with this new monster? They don't know, and that's why their circulations are going down, and they've cut all their staff, and really they're just picking the last few bits of money out of an older generation. I don't know what the age profile of the Sun is.
I assume it's fairly old.
It used to be very, very young.
Yeah, and so it used to be, right, if we're talking heyday of the paper, we're probably talking 80s, Kelvin Mackenzie. What you just said there about the sort of stories, their ideal story being the man out the cannon, etc. Was that his?
No, it was more Daily Mirror. So you had the Daily Mirror before that.
Yeah.
You had the Daily Mirror. Unrecognisable, but that was a monster. I mean, that was before TV, you see. It was as near as they could get to TV on paper.
Yeah.
Right. So lots and lots and lots of pictures, lots of stuff about film stars, because there weren't really such thing as TV stars in the 50s and 60s. Film stars, pictures, and funny old world stories.
Okay.
That was their thing. Kitten in a wine glass. Man fired from cannon hits own wife. Jolly Japes sort of stuff. And then Murdoch came along and he made a much harder, much nastier version for the boomers, the new rising generation.
I'd like to get a bit more into Mackenzie's personal sort of style of editorship if we can, because I think in the book you write that he sort of had a tendency to almost work backwards from a headline or a front page, rather than perhaps necessarily, the actual story itself.
Yeah, I mean, it's headline driven. I mean, in those days, basically the posh papers, the broadsheets, the Times, which in my opinion is now just a snobbish tabloid itself, to be honest. But the Times, the Financial Times, Guardian, these things hardly had pictures in them at all, and they had tiny headlines and they had loads and loads and loads of text. But these were reporters' newspapers, so the premium was on the reporters. So the big stars were your John Pilgers and people like that.
Yeah.
And they would go there and they'd find stuff out and they'd be the first thing. So the reporters had all the power, and the subs to get the production people, the production team, the editors.
Yep.
For a video generation or a social media, the people who gather the material, not the people who then edit it and put the funny graphics on, comments and all the rest of it. So the reporters, they had all the power. And don't touch my copy, they said to the editors. The editors were very low-grade people. They just checked the spelling and stuff. Tabloids were different. They were run by the production people. Their editorial meetings were not what's happening in Parliament today or how's the Ukraine conflict going. It would be what we're going to put on the front page that's funny and will smash the opposition on the newsstands. And someone would pipe up and say, well, I've heard that Huw Edwards has been up to something. Who's he? Oh, okay, we're up for it. And then it would be especially good if it had punning potential. I will swear on a stack of Bibles that they have used the headline, I've got Huws for you. Hypocritically, I've not checked. But that would be the great thing.
It'll be there.
And if you went down the corridor of the Sun, in the place of the mounted rhinos' heads on shields were these punning headlines that destroyed people just for fun. Zip me up before you go. That was George Michael. And wham. Sorry about that.
That's all right.
It was a different time.
Yeah.
No, I don't admire that. It's filthy, rotten, horrible.
So probably the most egregious case of that then, right, is Mackenzie's front page about Hillsborough.
Yeah.
I think I've got a quote here from your book. You call it this is a quote, most callous and inaccurate newspaper front pages of all time. Everyone's probably familiar with it now, but it read, "The truth and alleged that the 97 victims of Hillsborough were themselves responsible for what happened." Do you think, well, maybe if you could start by telling us the story of how that came into being, but also whether or not you think that those sort of loose morals and loose relationship with the truth under Mackenzie has outlasted his editorship of the paper.
Well, the paper's now 100 times blander than it was. I mean, you would buy the paper in those days to see which new taboo had been destroyed, which new red line had been crossed, because there was a sense of invulnerability. They had smashed their only realistic rival, the Mirror, in the circulation war, largely because the Mirror was run by a complete madman, an evil madman, greedy person, Robert Maxwell, blessed memory, and his family. Let's not get into that.
That's not.
We'd have to really reflect about that before going any further. But he certainly ran the paper into the ground, so they had no opposition. So they were just destroying people for fun in those days, I think. So Mackenzie think, right, what's the target for tonight? Which national institution? Which popular icon of the left can we drag through the mud today? What about Liverpool? Liverpool FC, the city of Liverpool. Liverpool was known in the 80s as constantly militant. Unions were strong, very against Thatcher, who the Sun idolised and Murdoch idolised. So the planets lined up. There was a commercial imperative and there was a prejudicial imperative, and it all worked as a piece of hating Liverpool. The Sun had very small sales in Liverpool to begin with, so there was nothing for them to lose. The Sun was the paper of the South and of Swindon, Basildon, Essex Man. They had some sales everywhere, but the Mirror was still big in the North. It was older, more factory working, more Labour, more social democratic, kind of fairer Britain. So the Sun was the paper of loads of money, Harry Enfield, there's Cockney scams and everything like that. Money mad, money making. And football came into that because, for example, football fans of London clubs like Tottenham, they would mock Liverpool fans as, you're all on the dole, you're scousers. They would wave wads of money at them and everything like that. So the Sun was getting into that vibe. So I remember that just before the Hillsborough story, the Sun had beaten, was it Crystal Palace? It was a London team, 11-0 in the FA Cup. It's a big story. It's a football mad paper. It's a tabloid. It was like 2 paras on page 7, not even on sports page or something. Liverpool have fluke win or something. And just to show, screw you, Liverpool. So along it came, right? And again, Mackenzie was out of control with this kind of power mad thing. So we're going to do the all-time humdinger thing. These people in Liverpool, they're always moaning. They're always what would now be called virtue signalling. Poor us. We're going to show you the real Scousers. And people in the office that we spoke to were saying, no. At least put it in inverted commas. At least say coppers, maybe bent coppers, who are now 100 years old, told us that this had happened. We have not seen it ourselves, Calvin. And we don't have any of those lovely affidavits. This is the say-so of a police officer. And he says, well, in front of a jury, I think the word of a police officer and a backbench rent-a-quote Tory MP, actually, who somehow confirmed it, or they were able to say he'd confirmed it, and that's all they had. They had the statement of the police, and they had a backbench MP, and that's not enough in professional journalism of any kind to justify that headline. And then the decked headlines down the side, which were about sexually assaulting the ambulance workers, robbing the corpses, urinating and defecating on the rescue workers, was staggering. And as you say, there was not a grain of truth in. There was some truth in. I'm going to try and put it as delicately as I can. If you're being crushed by the weight of 1,000 people, what's that? That's 100,000 kilos. You're going to emit body fluids, and they're going to be all over the place. So there was a grain of truth in that way, and then they used all the tabloid skill in a way to do this monstrous defaming of a whole city. They thought it was legally safe because in defamation law, you can't just defame a whole unincorporated group. You can't say the Chinese are all crooks or something like that. And then 100 million Chinese can't turn up and say, I'm not a crook, give me some money.
Yeah.
So they were careful not to identify people. They identified the victims, which they had pictures of the people as they were dying probably. And the Daily Star also did that, another tabloid, even worse, horrible. But they accused them, essentially the victims, of causing their own death because they're criminals. And as you say, it was burnt on the streets. I couldn't think of a bigger instance of a fake story. We now call it fake news, manufactured story. In the whole history of journalism, certainly modern journalism. And the Sun was burnt on the streets, and it's been the most effective consumer boycott. So if you don't like the Huw Edwards story, and you don't like Page 3, as was back in the day, don't buy it. They will stop doing it. Because ever since then they've bent over backwards to try and be nice to Liverpool. Which, to their credit, they have resisted getting into bed with them. And now, even now, after 20 or 30 years, there's still a slight dip in the stats. But for 10 years, it was an almost complete consumer boycott. And it cost them a fortune, not only in the lost sales, because they are buy it high, sell it cheap, but in the lost advertising revenue. So I worked it out accurately on the 10th anniversary, without being boring and going back to the figure. It was tens of millions on one story.
Impressive, really, isn't it?
Yeah, Mackenzie had to apologise. His calculation might well have been, people in the South, your Essex man and your Tottenham supporter, your Chelsea supporter, your Millwall supporter, of course, Millwall, which Mackenzie himself claims to be a supporter of. They're going to say no smoke without fire with these Scousers. Yeah. So by telling the truth, at last, somebody can speak up for the little man about these loathsome Scousers. Again, he's positioning himself as against the establishment, against the politically correct, against this, on the side of the people who will call a spade and who are Millwall supporters, without going too further down that direction.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it was a kind of internal racism against Liverpudlians.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess
many of whom were black as well.
Yeah, maybe the final question for me then is about how much this behaviour is unique to the Sun, and how much of it is actually really sort of the unethical reporting. The example we just discussed is obviously the most egregious. There are other examples, many other things we could talk about or reference. How much of this behaviour is something that we can chalk up to the Sun individually? How much of it actually is part of a broader tabloid culture in this country?
Oh, the impact on the practice of journalism of the Sun was immense.
Yeah.
It's almost like a AD and BC before the Sun. Everybody has to be a copy of the Sun. And that Murdochization has spread into the Guardian, the Times, definitely the Times.
Oh, yeah.
And so, I mean, a very lot of it is now TV, the agenda of the Guardian. It's about people who are appearing on TV. It's about celebrities, much more. It's about lifestyle. It's about getting an angle, an outrageous angle on the actual news. They've surrendered the news agenda first to television and now to Twitter, and they follow up trying to get an angle, like frankly we are doing now. The news was this family had turned up with this affidavit about Huw Davis, and we're talking about it. So that, and secondly, and now I'm going to seem really old-fashioned, the breaking of the trade unions removed a serious break on the ethical behaviour of editors. Because there was a time when there was a closed shop in the trade union, in Fleet Street, as it's called, on the tabloids. And reporters could say, well, I'm not going to write that story about Liverpool supporters because there's not enough evidence. All we've got is the uncorroborated statement of a copper. And he's a rent-a-quote copper as well. He works for our agency guy. You know, he's on a retainer. And some bozo backbench MP. And that's not enough. We need some proper statements. We need our own reporter. And so I'm not running that. And then if they were sacked, there'd be a strike. Now, if you refused anywhere to do what the editor or any higher up a person in a hierarchy, even in a small independent producer, one suspects, then the next rolling contract doesn't roll anymore, and you may well be out of the door with your possessions in a plastic bag and a very weak case for an industrial tribunal within the hour. Certainly at the Sun you would be. So the breaking of the unions is a big part of the story that's ignored.
This will be my last question. Yeah. Is the Sun wholly at fault here? Because for me, I don't know about you, there's a voyeurism here as an audience, as the public. I think for the most recent example, or a recent example I did a story on, was Caroline Flack and Love Island, and how everyone's sort of telling each other, hashtag be kind, we've got to look after each other. And it's sort of, okay, yeah, fine, all well and good. But the reason the interest in people like Caroline Flack exists is because you want to read the story about her. You want the inside line on her life. And I think, maybe I've got this the wrong way around, but if there isn't an appetite for this kind of information, the Sun doesn't publish it.
Of course. And philosophically, my standpoint, which who cares what my standpoint is try not to moralise about anything, actually.
Yeah.
It's a business, and their business is turning the prejudices of the British public into money. That's all it is. And some of those prejudices are horrible and probably should be banned. And some of them are mild and vaguely stupid. But they trying to guess what the people on their way to work in the few remaining jobs that there are in the country, and they can't be bothered to get on the phone. They're not allowed to get on the phone for some reason. They're driving a train, for instance. So they're driving a train and they're glancing at the Sun. Don't do this at home. And what does that person want to hear? And if you can guess that accurately, and fair play to Mackenzie, he probably did chime with with a minority, but a big minority, 4 or 5 million people who believed that the country was being run by pinko, woke, killjoys and establishment this and all the rest of it, and he was on the side of great liberalisation, particularly in the sexual thing, and that's come to pass. I mean, people are very calm now about behaviour, sexual behaviour, younger people in particular. That would have been a huge scandal even in the 80s. So things have changed. That's another reason why there's far fewer scandals to hypocritically poke your finger at these days, I suppose.
Chris Horrie, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, good luck with that.
Thank you.